Lewis Hamilton just delivered one of his strongest qualifying performances of the season, and Ferrari still collapsed around him. That is why tension inside Maranello is suddenly exploding. Because this was not a case of Hamilton making mistakes. He attacked the walls of Montreal aggressively, braked later than almost anyone, outqualified Charles Leclerc, looked completely alive around a circuit where confidence means everything. And after all of that effort, Ferrari still finished more than 3/10 behind Mercedes. In modern Formula One, that gap feels brutal, especially when George Russell and Kimi Antonelli locked out the front row, while Ferrari could only manage 5th and 6th. But here is where this story becomes dangerous for Ferrari, because the problem no longer looks like the drivers. It looks like the SF-26 itself is fundamentally broken in ways Ferrari still cannot fully understand. And one Hamilton quote is now haunting the entire project harder than ever. The Ferrari simulator is useless. At the time, many people thought it was frustration after Miami. Now it sounds like a warning Ferrari ignored. Because behind the scenes, Ferrari is dealing with a massive correlation crisis between the simulator and the real car. Upgrades are failing. Engineers reportedly no longer trust the data completely. And every new development now feels more like a gamble than progress. And after Canadian GP sprint qualifying, Hamilton's body language made one thing terrifyingly clear. He may be starting to lose patience with the entire Ferrari project. The first signs of Hamilton's frustration appeared before sprint qualifying had even finished. And most people watching the broadcast probably missed them completely. Because while fans focused on the final positions, the real story was hidden inside the gap itself. Lewis Hamilton finished 5th. Charles Leclerc finished 6th. On paper, that does not sound catastrophic, but the numbers behind it were brutal. Hamilton was more than 3/10 slower than George Russell's Mercedes. Leclerc was nearly half a second behind. In modern Formula One, that kind of difference feels massive, especially on a short lap like Montreal. And the painful part for Ferrari is this. Hamilton actually drove extremely well. You could see it from the first laps of the weekend. The Circuit Gilles Villeneuve rewards confidence more than almost any other track on the calendar. Drivers must attack heavy braking zones aggressively, throw the car over curbs, and commit inches away from concrete walls. The moment a driver hesitates, lap time disappears instantly. But Hamilton did not hesitate. He looked sharp under braking, comfortable rotating the car through the chicanes, aggressive attacking the final sector. For the first time in several weekends, he genuinely looked connected to the SF-26 underneath him. And that is exactly why this weekend became so uncomfortable inside Ferrari. Because Hamilton's pace exposed something deeper than setup mistakes or driver adaptation problems. It exposed the limit of the car itself. According to the report, Ferrari arrived in Canada already carrying the weight of a major technical crisis after Miami. The simulator and the real car are no longer behaving the same way. That may sound technical, but the effect is devastatingly simple. Imagine preparing for a boxing match using training footage that teaches the wrong movements. The harder you train, the worse the mistake becomes. That is basically Ferrari's reality right now. The simulator predicts one behavior. The SF-26 reacts differently once it reaches the track. And because Formula One teams rely on simulation for almost every development decision, the consequences become enormous very quickly. Aerodynamics, ride height, suspension balance, tire preparation, energy deployment. Everything depends on correlation between simulation and reality. If that correlation breaks, development becomes guesswork. That is why Hamilton's explosive comment after Miami sent shockwaves through Maranello. The Ferrari simulator is useless. At the time, some people dismissed it as frustration. Now it looks much more serious. Because according to former Ferrari engineer Rob Smedley, when teams lose correlation between their simulation tools and the real car, they are forced into reverse engineering instead of true development. In simple terms, Ferrari is no longer only trying to make the SF-26 faster. Now they are trying to understand why previous upgrades failed in the first place. That changes everything. Because while Mercedes arrived in Canada with radical upgrades that immediately worked exactly as expected, Ferrari arrived with conservative changes focused mainly on understanding the car better. That difference became brutally obvious during sprint qualifying. Mercedes looked decisive. Ferrari looked uncertain. And this is where Hamilton's performance became almost dangerous politically inside the team. Because he actually extracted a strong lap from the SF-26. He even outqualified Leclerc by 0.084 seconds. That matters enormously at Ferrari. Leclerc is normally the qualifying reference, especially over one lap. But in Canada, Hamilton looked more comfortable pushing the car to its limit, more willing to attack the track aggressively. And yet Ferrari still ended up nowhere near the front row. That is the terrifying realization now spreading inside Maranello. If Hamilton can still drive at this level, and the gap remains this large, then the weakness may be buried much deeper inside the concept of the SF-26 than Ferrari originally believed. Then sprint qualifying exposed the most dangerous part of Ferrari's crisis. Lewis Hamilton was no longer struggling with the car. He was outperforming it. And inside Formula One, that changes the entire conversation immediately. Because when a driver underperforms, teams can still believe the solution is simple. Better setup, more confidence, cleaner execution. But when a 7-time world champion extracts almost everything possible from a car, and the result is still disappointing, panic starts spreading through the garage very quickly. That is exactly what happened in Canada. Hamilton looked fully committed all session long. He attacked braking zones later than expected, rotated the car aggressively through the chicanes, carried confidence over curbs where other drivers hesitated, and for the first time in several weekends, he genuinely looked comfortable driving the SF-26 near the limit. That should have been a massive positive sign for Ferrari. Instead, it became terrifying, because even with Hamilton operating at a very high level, the car still looked fundamentally limited compared to Mercedes. George Russell and Kimi Antonelli locked out the front row comfortably. Ferrari remained stuck on the third row. That gap completely changed the mood around the team. And the most painful part for Ferrari may be the comparison itself. Mercedes arrived in Canada with aggressive upgrades and immediate confidence. Their package worked exactly as expected from the first session. Ferrari arrived carrying uncertainty, not because the engineers lacked talent, because the team no longer fully trusts its own tools. That is the real crisis hidden underneath the SF-26 right now. According to the report, Ferrari's simulation data and real track behavior are no longer correlating correctly. And that creates a devastating chain reaction inside Formula One development. Imagine trying to fix a watch while every clock around you shows a different time. That is essentially Ferrari's engineering situation. The simulator predicts one aerodynamic response. The track produces another. The wind tunnel suggests one setup direction. The real car reacts differently once the tires hit the asphalt. And once that disconnect appears, every future upgrade becomes dangerous. Because now Ferrari cannot fully trust whether new parts are actually improving the car or simply masking deeper weaknesses temporarily. That is exactly why former Formula One figures like Rob Smedley and Otmar Safnauer sounded so concerned in the report. When correlation collapses, teams stop developing efficiently. Now they spend resources trying to understand their own confusion instead of chasing performance directly. That is catastrophic during a championship fight, especially against rivals who suddenly look completely certain about their direction. And this is where Hamilton's frustration becomes impossible to ignore emotionally. Because before Canada, he publicly rejected retirement rumors completely. He talked about staying in Formula One for years. He sounded motivated and committed to Ferrari's future. But motivation alone cannot solve structural problems inside the car. And after sprint qualifying, Hamilton's body language told a much darker story than his words. This looked like a driver realizing he may already be operating near the maximum potential of the SF-26, while the ceiling itself remains too low. That realization is dangerous for any Formula One team, especially Ferrari, because once elite drivers begin losing faith in the project direction, pressure spreads everywhere internally. Now engineers feel urgency, management feels pressure, development decisions become political. Every failed update becomes emotionally heavier. And Ferrari already arrived in Canada under enormous tension after the failed Miami upgrade package. The team introduced major aerodynamic changes in Miami, expecting a breakthrough. Instead, the car failed to respond as predicted. That failure now hangs over every new development decision, which explains why Ferrari came to Montreal with conservative updates focused mainly on understanding the car instead of aggressively chasing lap time. But Formula One punishes hesitation brutally. While Ferrari searches for understanding, Mercedes keeps evolving. McLaren keeps building consistency. And Red Bull still has Verstappen capable of changing weekends alone. That is why Canada feels so dangerous for Ferrari internally. because this was supposed to be a circuit where Hamilton's strengths could compensate for the weaknesses of the SF-26. And Hamilton actually delivered exactly that. The car simply did not respond enough in return. And now the biggest fear inside Maranello is becoming impossible to ignore. What if the SF-26 is not simply unfinished? What if Ferrari built the wrong foundation entirely? And this is where Ferrari's situation becomes genuinely terrifying for the rest of the season. Because technical problems can usually be fixed with time. But once belief inside the project starts collapsing, Formula One teams become dangerous places internally. And right now, Ferrari suddenly looks like a team caught between confusion and desperation at the exact same moment. Because there are still flashes where the SF-26 looks fast. That is what makes this crisis so frustrating for them. Hamilton proved in Canada that the car still contains performance somewhere underneath the surface. The report mentions Ferrari specifically worked on front-wing adjustments, traction setup changes, and brake configurations designed for Montreal's heavy braking zones and low-speed chicanes. And during parts of qualifying, those improvements actually looked promising. The Ferrari rotated more cleanly through the chicanes. Hamilton especially looked more connected to the front end than during several previous weekends. But then the deeper weakness returned again. Consistency. That is where the SF-26 keeps collapsing compared to Mercedes. Because modern Formula One is not only about one strong corner or one aggressive lap. It is about giving the driver confidence everywhere around the circuit at the same time. And right now, Ferrari still cannot guarantee that. One corner the car feels sharp. The next corner the balance shifts unexpectedly. One braking zone feels stable. The next traction phase suddenly becomes nervous. And those tiny moments of uncertainty destroy lap time across an entire qualifying session. That is exactly what Hamilton's pace exposed so brutally in Canada. Because when an elite driver pushes this aggressively, and the gap still remains huge, engineers stop blaming execution. Now, they start questioning the foundation of the car itself. And according to the report, Ferrari is already redirecting engineering resources towards solving the simulator correlation crisis instead of focusing purely on raw performance development. That changes the entire championship outlook immediately. Imagine trying to win a war while rebuilding your weapons factory at the same time. That is basically Ferrari's reality now. And Formula One does not slow down for teams trying to recover understanding. Mercedes keeps evolving aggressively. McLaren keeps becoming more complete. And Red Bull still has Verstappen capable of creating chaos every weekend. Meanwhile, Ferrari is trapped trying to answer two terrifying questions simultaneously. How do we make the SF-26 faster? And even worse, do we actually understand the car correctly at all anymore? That second question is the one that destroys confidence inside teams. Because once engineers stop trusting the simulator fully, every future upgrade becomes emotionally heavier. Now, every new part carries doubt before it even reaches the track. What if the data is wrong again? What if the aerodynamic gains disappear in real conditions? What if the balance shifts unpredictably once the tires heat up? That hesitation spreads everywhere. And hesitation is deadly in Formula One development battles, especially inside Ferrari, where pressure multiplies faster than almost anywhere else in motorsport. That is why Hamilton's frustration after qualifying felt so significant emotionally. Not because he looked defeated, because he looked like a driver realizing he may already be extracting close to the maximum possible from SF-26, while the car itself still cannot fight at the front consistently. That realization changes relationships inside teams very quickly. Drivers become more demanding. Engineers become more defensive. Management becomes more political. And every disappointing weekend starts carrying long-term consequences. The terrifying part for Ferrari is that Canada was actually supposed to suit Hamilton perfectly. Heavy braking, low-speed traction, confidence near walls. These are exactly the conditions where elite drivers can compensate for mechanical weaknesses. And Hamilton did compensate. He outqualified Leclerc. He attacked the track aggressively. He looked motivated and fully committed. But the SF-26 still looked fundamentally slower than Mercedes. That may be the most painful conclusion Ferrari could possibly take away from Friday in Montreal. Not that Hamilton struggled. That he finally looked strong again, and the car still was not enough.